I came home from the hospital on a Thursday morning in late March, and the first thing I noticed was that someone had moved the parking sign. It was a small thing, a green and white sign my late wife Dorothy had special ordered 12 years ago, the kind with raised lettering that said, Marsh and Doyle Heating and Cooling, established 1986. It had stood at the left edge of the gravel lot since the day it arrived. Dorothy had driven out to the shop herself to approve the placement. She made the installer move it 3 inches to the left so it would catch the afternoon light the right way. I had not thought about that sign in years, the way you stop thinking about things that have always been exactly where they belong. But when Kevin pulled his truck into the lot that Thursday, I saw the sign was on the right side now. Not far from where it had been, just wrong enough that I felt it before I understood it. Kevin was talking. He was telling me about the quarterly service calls and the new van they had leased while I was in the hospital, and I was nodding the way a man nods when he is only half listening, because the other half of him is standing in the lot looking at a sign that someone moved without asking. I had been in the hospital for 11 days. A cardiac procedure, the kind the doctors call routine until it is happening to you, and then nothing about it feels routine at all. Kevin had driven me in himself. He had sat with me the first 2 days, brought me coffee from the machine down the hall, and told me not to worry about the business. He said, Dad, I have been running the day-to-day for 2 years now. Nothing is going to fall apart in 11 days. I believed him. I had no reason not to. My wife Dorothy died 14 months before that March morning. She had been the kind of woman who understood paperwork, the way some people understand weather, not by studying it, but by living close enough to it that she could feel when something was about to change. Every January, she and I sat at the kitchen table with every business document we owned and went through them together. She called it the First Sunday Review. 34 years we did that. The last time we did it, she was already sick, and she still insisted on sitting up straight and reading every page. She had a green metal fireproof lockbox she bought at a hardware sale years ago. She kept it in the back of the bedroom closet, behind her winter coats. She told me once, Gerald, that box is the only thing in this house that does not require trust to function properly. I had smiled at that. I had not opened the box since she passed. Standing in the lot that Thursday, with Kevin still talking beside me, I looked at the sign on the wrong side of the gravel, and I thought about something Dorothy used to say. She said, a handshake is a memory, and a memory fades, but a signature on the right paper lasts longer than anyone in the room. I did not know yet what Kevin had done while I was sedated in that hospital bed. I did not know about the amended agreement or the county filing or the line of credit he had drawn against the business without my name on the approval. I did not know that a document exists with my consent listed on a Tuesday when I was not capable of consenting to anything at all. What I knew was that the sign was on the wrong side of the lot, and that before Kevin opened the shop door, a vendor named Carl Bremer pulled up in a white supply truck, climbed out, walked straight past me with a nod, and handed Kevin a clipboard while saying, "Good to see you, Mr. Marsh. Been dealing with your father long enough. Good that you are the one in charge now." Kevin did not correct him. I stood there with my hospital discharge folder still folded under my arm, and I watched my son hold that clipboard, and I thought, I need to find out what papers have my name on them right now. Kevin made eggs that morning. He moved around my kitchen the way people move around a space they have decided belongs to them, opening the cabinet above the stove without looking, knowing exactly where Dorothy used to keep the salt. I sat at the kitchen table and watched him and did not say anything about Carl Bremer or the sign or the clipboard. There are moments when a man understands that the most useful thing he can do is be quiet and watch. Kevin set a plate in front of me and poured coffee into the blue mug I have used every morning for 20 years and sat down across from me with his own cup and asked how I was feeling. I told him I was feeling well enough. He said the doctor had called the procedure a success and that I should take it easy for at least 2 weeks before thinking about the shop. I said I understood. He said Sandra had organized a meal schedule with some of the neighbors so I would not have to cook for myself the first week. I thanked him for that. He talked about Tyler for a while. His son, my grandson, 16 years old and already 6 feet tall and more interested in cars than schoolwork. which Kevin said with the kind of tired affection a father uses when he has accepted something he cannot change. Tyler had asked about me while I was in the hospital. Kevin said he had visited once on the second day and sat beside my bed for an hour while I was still groggy from the anesthesia. I had not known that. It meant something to me. I ate the eggs and drank the coffee and let Kevin talk, and the whole time I was watching the way he held his cup, the way he glanced at his phone twice without picking it up, the way he shifted it in his chair when there was a pause long enough that he might have to wait for me to fill it. Kevin had always been a capable man. I had watched him grow from a boy who used to ride in the service van with me on Saturday calls to a man who could quote material costs and scheduling windows the way other men quote sports statistics. He had learned the business honestly, working summers through high school and full-time after 2 years of community college when he decided a 4-year degree was not what he wanted. I had never pushed him toward the business. He had chosen it himself, and for a long time I had been proud of that choice. Sandra had come into his life about 12 years ago. She was smart and organized and had a way of speaking that made ordinary suggestions sound like conclusions that had already been reached. She worked as a paralegal at a firm in Columbus, and she understood legal language the way Dorothy had understood paperwork, with a comfort that came from years of handling it. I had always liked Sandra well enough. She was good to Tyler, and she kept Kevin focused. But Dorothy had said something once, quietly, after a family dinner, that stayed with me. She had said, "Sandra knows the difference between what a document says and what a document means. And I am not always sure she uses that knowledge gently." I had not thought about that in years. Kevin finished his coffee and stood and rinsed his cup at the sink and said he needed to get back to the shop for an afternoon estimate. He said Margaret would handle the phones and that Ray Doyle had called twice while I was in the hospital just to check in. He said Ray was doing well for a man his age and that I should call him when I felt up to it. I said I would. Kevin put on his jacket and picked up his keys from the counter and said, "Dad, I want you to know that everything at the shop is in good order. You do not need to worry about anything. Just rest and let yourself get strong again." He said it the way a man says something he has practiced. I told him I appreciated it. He squeezed my shoulder once on his way to the door and then he was gone, and I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of my own house and listened to his truck pull out of the driveway. I finished my coffee. I looked at the place where Dorothy used to sit, the chair across from mine with the small cushion she had tied to the back because the wood was hard. The cushion was still there. Nobody had moved it. After a while I got up and walked to the bedroom and stood in front of the closet. I did not open it. I just stood there with one hand on the frame and thought about the green metal lockbox behind Dorothy's winter coats, and thought about what she had said about signatures lasting longer than anyone in the room. Then I went back to the kitchen and called the shop. Margaret answered on the second ring. Her voice had the careful warmth of a woman who is glad to hear from someone, but is also choosing her words before she speaks them. She said it was good to have me home. She asked how I was feeling. I said I was feeling fine and asked how things were at the shop. There was a pause. Not a long pause, but the kind that lives in the space between what someone wants to say and what they have decided they should say instead. She said, "Things are moving along, Mr. Marsh. Kevin has been keeping everything running." She paused again and then said, "We have missed having you around," I said. "I hope to come by sometime that week," she said. She thought that would be a fine idea. After I hung up, I sat for a long time at that kitchen table. The afternoon light came through the window above the sink the way it always has, falling across the same spot on the floor it has always found. I thought about Margaret's pause. I thought about Carl Bremer handing Kevin that clipboard. I thought about the sign on the wrong side of the gravel lot. None of those things told me anything on their own. But I had spent 38 years building something from the ground up, and a man who has done that learns to read the small signs the way a farmer reads the sky, not because any one cloud means rain, but because he has lived close enough to the weather to know when something is about to change. I was not ready to go to the shop yet, but I was not going to wait 2 weeks either. The next morning I drove myself. The shop looked the same from the outside. The bay doors were open and I could hear the sound of someone running a pressure test on a line in the back, that familiar hiss and settle that I had heard 10,000 times over 38 years. The service vans were lined up along the side of the building the way they always were in the morning before the crews went out. Someone had painted the trim on the front office window, which needed doing, and I was glad to see it done. I sat in my car for a moment before going in. The shop was a plain cinder block building on a county road about 4 miles outside of town. Ray Doyle and I had leased it in 1986 with a handshake and a check that represented most of what either of us had saved. We had built the client list by driving every back road in the county that first summer, knocking on farmhouse doors, and leaving paper flyers at the feed stores and the hardware shops. Dorothy had designed the original logo on a legal pad at the kitchen table. We had grown the business slowly and carefully the way you grow anything that is meant to last. I got out of the car and went inside. The front office smelled like coffee and motor oil, and the particular dusty warmth of a building that has been heated by its own work for decades. Margaret was at her desk near the window with a stack of invoices in front of her and a pencil behind her ear. She looked up when I came in, and her face did something complicated, a genuine smile with something careful underneath it. She stood and said it was good to see me on my feet. I said it was good to be on them. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking and set it on the corner of her desk, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing important, the kind of conversation that happens when two people are deciding how to begin a different conversation. I asked her how the billing cycle had gone while I was away. She said it had gone fine. I asked if there had been any issues with the quarterly accounts. She said Kevin had handled most of that directly. I asked if there had been any changes to the account structure that I should know about. She picked up her pencil and looked at it for a moment, and then set it down again. She said, "Mr. Marsh, I am going to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I am not certain what it means. I only know what I saw on the statements." I told her to go ahead. She said that about 18 months ago a new line of credit had appeared on the business accounts. She said it was listed under the operating expenses column, but it had not been there before, and she had not been asked to process the original approval paperwork. She said she had asked Kevin about it at the time, and he had told her it was a bridge line the bank had offered, and that he and I had discussed it and agreed to it. She said she had no reason to doubt that then, but she had printed a copy of the original ledger entry when she first noticed it because something about the way it appeared felt unusual to her. She had kept that copy in her desk drawer. She opened the drawer and took out a folded piece of paper and set it on the desk between us. I looked at the date on the ledger entry. 18 months ago. Dorothy had been gone for 2 months by then. I had been at the shop every day that month, still working because working was the only thing that kept the grief from sitting directly on top of me. I had not discussed any line of credit with Kevin. I had not discussed any bridge loan or banking arrangement of any kind. I picked up the paper and folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. Margaret watched me do that and did not say anything. I finished my coffee and thanked her and walked back through the office toward the service area. 2 of the technicians were loading equipment into one of the vans, and they both nodded at me and said good morning. And there was a stiffness to it, not unfriendly but careful, the way people are around someone they have been told something about. I found Kevin in the back office, which had been my office for 30 years before I gave Kevin the desk 3 years ago when he took over the day-to-day scheduling. He was on the phone when I came in, and he held up one finger the way a man does when he wants you to know he sees you but cannot stop. I sat in the chair across from the desk and waited. He finished the call and set the phone down and said, "Dad, I did not know you were coming in today. I thought you were resting." I said I was feeling well enough to drive. He said the doctor had recommended 2 weeks. I said I appreciated that and asked him to tell me about the amended partnership agreement. The room got quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of someone who does not know what you mean. The quiet of someone deciding how much of what they know they are going to share. Kevin leaned back in the chair and said, "I was going to talk to you about that when you were feeling stronger." He said it in a calm and reasonable voice, the voice a person uses when they have rehearsed the moment. He said the original agreement had some outdated language in it. language that did not reflect how the business actually operated anymore, and that his attorney had suggested cleaning it up while we had a natural transition period. I asked him what he meant by a natural transition period. He said, "Dad, you had a cardiac procedure. You are 72 years old. It made sense to clarify the operational structure while things were in motion." I asked him when the amended agreement had been filed with the county. He said he did not remember the exact date offhand. I told him that was fine and that I would check myself. I stood up and thanked him for the eggs the morning before and told him I was going to head home and rest the way the doctor suggested. He looked at me with the expression of a man who cannot tell whether he has been believed or not, which is exactly the expression I wanted him to have. I drove home and went directly to the bedroom closet. I moved Dorothy's winter coats aside and lifted the green metal lockbox from the shelf and carried it to the kitchen table. I had not opened it in 14 months. The key was on my key ring, a small brass key Dorothy had taped to the inside back cover of the household binder years ago. I found it and unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside were the January review papers going back 34 years, each year clipped together and labeled in Dorothy's handwriting. The original partnership agreement was there, the one Ray Doyle and I had signed in 1986, and the amended version from 1998 when we had restructured the equity split, both signed by all three partners, both notarized, and there was an envelope I had not seen before. It was a plain white envelope with my name written on the front in Dorothy's handwriting. The letters were careful and a little uneven, the way her handwriting had become in her last months. I stood at the kitchen table and held it for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a single folded page. She had written, "Gerald, if you are reading this, it means you finally opened the box without me telling you to. That alone means something happened that I want you to be careful about. I organized the January papers every year so that you would always know exactly what we agreed to and exactly what we signed. Do not let anyone tell you the original agreement does not matter anymore. It matters. It is the one with our names on it from the beginning. Yours and Ray Doyle and mine as witness. Nobody can undo a signature. They can only try to replace it with a newer one and hope you do not notice. Pay attention to the dates, Gerald. The dates are always where the truth lives." I sat down at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then I called Ray Doyle. Ray Doyle answered on the first ring, which told me he had been expecting my call. Ray was not the kind of man who answered on the first ring for just anyone. He was the kind of man who let the phone ring twice on principle, the way his father had taught him, because a man who answers too fast looks like he has been waiting by the phone. And Ray had always believed that a man should never look like he is waiting for anything. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Gerald, good to hear your voice. How are you feeling?" I told him I was feeling well enough and that I needed to ask him something directly. He said, "Go ahead." I asked him if he had received any paperwork from the business in the last month, any amended documents or revised agreements sent to his address for review or signature. There was a pause on Ray's end. Not the careful kind, not the kind where a person is deciding what to say. The kind where a person is relieved that someone has finally asked the right question. He said yes. He said a document arrived at his house about 6 weeks ago. An amended partnership agreement. It had been sent by a law office in Columbus, and it listed Kevin as the primary operating partner and restructured the equity arrangement. It listed me as a retired advisory member with no voting rights and no financial interest in business decisions going forward. Ray said his name was on it too, reduced from minority partner to silent stakeholder. He said there was a notation on the signature page that indicated Gerald Marsh had already reviewed and consented to the terms. I asked him if he had signed it. He said no. He said something about it did not sit right, and he had put it in a drawer and waited to see if I would call. I asked him when exactly the document said I had consented. He went quiet for a moment, and I heard the sound of a drawer opening and papers moving. Then he came back and read me the date, a Tuesday in March, the week I had been in the hospital. I wrote the date down on the notepad Dorothy used to keep beside the telephone. I wrote it carefully and underlined it twice. Ray said, "Gerald, I have been doing business with you for 38 years, and I know your name on a document, and I know when something is not right. I did not sign because I wanted to talk to you first. I am glad you called. I thanked him and told him I would be in touch soon and that I needed him to keep that document safe and not to mention to Kevin that we had spoken. Ray said, already ahead of you on both counts. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with Dorothy's letter in front of me and the notepad with the date written on it and the ledger copy Margaret had given me folded beside them. I looked at those three things together and thought about what Kevin had said in the back office. He had said the original agreement had outdated language. He had said it in the calm voice of a man who had thought carefully about how to explain something he had not expected to explain so soon. I thought about Sandra. I thought about what Dorothy had said about Sandra, knowing the difference between what a document says and what a document means. A paralegal at a Columbus law firm would know how to find an attorney willing to file an amended agreement. She would know the right language to use. She would know which notations could be added to a signature page to make consent look official without requiring the consenting party to be present. I was not angry yet. Anger was something I could not afford. The way a man with a leaking roof cannot afford to stand in the rain cursing the sky when he should be finding a bucket and calling a roofer. What I needed now was to understand the full shape of what Kevin had done and why he had needed to do it before I came home from the hospital. The line of credit Margaret had found was 18 months old. Kevin had told her he and I had discussed it. We had not. That line of credit had been drawn against the business without my knowledge or my signature, which meant either the original partnership agreement had a gap that Kevin had exploited or someone had found a way around the signature requirement. Either way, it meant Kevin had been carrying a financial arrangement for a year and a half that he could not explain to me without admitting he had acted without my authority. And now the amended agreement would have removed me from the partnership entirely, which would mean there was no longer a Gerald Marsh to question any financial decision Kevin had made, or was planning to make. I picked up Dorothy's letter and read it a third time. Pay attention to the dates she had written. The dates are always where the truth lives. The date on the consent notation was a Tuesday in March. I had been admitted to the hospital the Sunday before that Tuesday, and I had not been discharged until the following Thursday. I had been sedated for the cardiac procedure on that Tuesday morning. I had a discharge summary in the folder the hospital had sent home with me, still sitting on the counter where Kevin had set it when we came in from the truck. I got up and found the folder and opened it on the kitchen table. The admission date was listed clearly. The procedure date was listed clearly. The discharge date was listed clearly. The Tuesday in March was listed as the day of the procedure, the day I had been sedated. A man cannot consent to a legal document while he is sedated. That is not a complicated legal principle. That is plain sense. And if the amended agreement listed that Tuesday as the date of my consent, then either Kevin had not thought carefully about the hospital records, or he had believed I would never look closely enough to notice. I thought about that for a long time. Kevin was not a careless man. He had been running the day-to-day operations of a business for 3 years, and he had done it competently. He knew how to read a schedule and he knew how to plan ahead, which meant he had not overlooked the hospital date. He had calculated that I would not check it. He had looked at his 72-year-old father recovering from a cardiac procedure, still grieving his wife of 40 years, and he had calculated that the old man would not look closely enough at the dates. I folded the discharge summary back into the folder and set it beside the notepad and Dorothy's letter and Margaret's ledger copy. Then I went to the bedroom and got dressed properly, not the comfortable clothes I had been wearing since coming home from the hospital, but the clothes I wore when I meant to be taken seriously. Good trousers and the dark gray shirt Dorothy had always said made me look like I knew what I was doing. I came back to the kitchen and looked at the green metal lockbox still open on the table, the January review papers stacked neatly inside it, the way Dorothy had always kept them. I took out the original 1986 partnership agreement and the 1998 amendment and set them carefully on top of the other papers on the table. Then I sat down and thought about who I needed to call next. Not Kevin, not yet. What I needed was someone who understood what these documents meant and what options a man in my position actually had. Someone who worked in business law and had no connection to Kevin or Sandra, or any law office in Columbus that might have helped file a fraudulent amendment. I thought about Howard Greer, who had handled the business incorporation back in 1986 and had retired about 5 years ago. His son David had taken over the practice, and I had met David twice at chamber events and found him to be a straightforward man who spoke plainly about complicated things. I picked up the phone and called David Greer's office and asked for an appointment. The receptionist said the earliest available was Friday morning at 9. I said Friday morning was fine. I hung up and looked at the papers spread across the kitchen table and thought about Kevin making eggs in my kitchen that morning, moving around the space with the ease of a man who has already decided how things are going to be arranged. I thought about the sign on the wrong side of the gravel lot. I thought about Carl Bremer handing Kevin that clipboard and saying, "Good that you are the one in charge now," and Kevin not correcting him. I thought about Dorothy buying that green metal lockbox at a hardware sale because she believed in keeping the right papers in the right place, and about the note she had left inside it. For a moment, she had apparently anticipated more clearly than I had. I reached over and picked up her letter one more time and held it without reading it. Just held it. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was doing what it always does in late March in Ohio, coming in low and pale through the bare branches of the maple tree. Dorothy had planted the year Tyler was born. She had wanted Tyler to be able to climb it someday. He had climbed it twice, both times getting higher than Kevin thought was safe, and both times coming down with the particular satisfaction of a boy who has done exactly what he was told not to do. The tree was tall enough now that the branches reached the roof line. Dorothy would have liked knowing that. I set her letter down and picked up the original partnership agreement and read the first page slowly, every line, the way she and I used to read every page together at this same table on the first Sunday of every January for 34 years. My name was on it clearly, Gerald Raymond Marsh. Equal partner, full voting rights, full financial stake, notarized and filed in March of 1986. Nobody had asked me to sign anything else. Friday morning could not come soon enough. David Greer had his father's office, but not his father's furniture. Howard Greer had worked behind a massive oak desk that took up half the room and made you feel like you were being received by someone important. David worked at a plain rectangular table with a computer on one end and a neat stack of folders on the other, and he sat across from you like a man who wanted to feel that the two of you were solving something together rather than that he was dispensing wisdom from a position of authority. I had liked Howard. I found I liked David more. I laid everything out on the table between us. The original 1986 partnership agreement, the 1998 amendment, Margaret's ledger copy showing the line of credit, the hospital discharge summary with the admission and procedure dates. The notepad page with the Tuesday date Ray Doyle had read to me from the amended agreement consent notation, and Dorothy's letter, which I had folded back into its envelope and brought without fully deciding why. David read through everything slowly and without speaking. He was the kind of attorney who did not perform thinking. He just did it quietly while you waited. When he finished, he set the papers down and folded his hands on the table and said, "Mr. Marsh, I want to ask you a few questions and I need you to answer them as precisely as you can." I told him to go ahead. He asked me whether I had ever verbally agreed to any change in the partnership structure, even informally, even in a way I had not meant as a legal commitment. I said no. He asked whether I had signed any document in the past 2 years that I had not read fully before signing. I said no. Dorothy had spent 40 years making sure I read everything before I signed it. He almost smiled at that. He asked whether Kevin had ever discussed the line of credit with me in any context, even as a passing mention, even framed as something he was only considering. I said no. He asked me to confirm the dates of my hospital admission and discharge, and I pointed to the discharge summary and he wrote the dates down on his own notepad. Then he said, "The consent notation on the amended agreement lists a date that falls inside your hospital admission window." I said yes, he said, "And you were sedated for a procedure on that specific date." I said yes. He wrote something else on his notepad and underlined it and then looked up at me and said, "Mr. Marsh, what you have described is not a clerical error, A consent notation placed on a legal document on a date when the consenting party was under anesthesia is not an oversight. It is a fraudulent representation of consent. Combined with an unauthorized line of credit drawn against a partnership without the signature of an equal partner, you are describing a pattern of conduct that goes beyond a family disagreement about business structure. He paused and then said, "I want to be careful about the word I use here, but what I am describing is the kind of conduct that has legal consequences beyond a simple business dispute." I told him I understood. He asked me about Ray Doyle, and I told him what Ray had said, that the amended agreement had arrived at Ray's address for signature, that Ray had not signed it, and that Ray still had his copy. David said that was significant. He said a co-founder who had refused to sign a fraudulent amendment and had retained his copy of the document was an important witness, and that Ray's unsigned copy combined with the county filing date would create a clear record of what had been attempted. He asked me whether I had spoken to Kevin since coming home from the shop. I said Kevin had called the evening after my visit to check in. He had sounded normal. He had asked how I was feeling and mentioned that Tyler had a track meet that weekend and asked if I felt well enough to come. I had said maybe. Kevin had not mentioned the amended agreement or the conversation we had in the back office. David said that was useful information. He said a man who does not mention an important conversation usually believes the conversation went in his favor. He asked me to leave all the documents with him except Dorothy's letter, which he said I should keep. He said he would make copies of everything and begin pulling the county business filing records to confirm the submission date. He said he would also want to speak with Margaret Foss directly about the ledger entry and the timeline of the line of credit. I said I would let Margaret know to expect his call. Before I left, I asked him how long something like this typically took to address. He said it depended on how Kevin responded when the evidence was presented formally. He said some people in Kevin's position, when shown clearly that the documentation did not support their version of events, chose to cooperate rather than compound the problem. He said others chose to dig in, which made the process longer and more expensive for everyone involved. I asked him which he thought Kevin would do. He thought about it for a moment and said, "Based on what you have described, your son is a capable and organized man who made a calculated decision and believed the calculation was sound. When a man like that discovers the calculation was wrong, he usually has enough sense to stop digging. But the woman behind him may think differently." I drove home thinking about that. Sandra. Kevin was capable, but Sandra was precise. Kevin had the motive and the opportunity, but Sandra had the legal knowledge to make it look procedural rather than criminal. She would have known how to find an attorney willing to file the amendment. She would have known how to word the consent notation in language that looked routine. She would have calculated the risks the way a paralegal calculates risks, by identifying the weakest point in the evidence chain and making sure it held. The weakest point she had calculated was me, an elderly widower recovering from heart surgery who had spent 14 months grieving and pulling back from the business. She had looked at that picture and concluded that I would not look closely at the dates, that I would not check the hospital records against the consent notation, that I would accept Kevin's explanation about outdated language and natural transition periods and be grateful for the retirement package they were planning to offer me. She had underestimated Dorothy's lockbox. When I got home, I called Ray Doyle again. I told him I had met with an attorney and that I needed him to do two things. I needed him to keep the amended agreement document safe and to be available to speak with David Greer when asked. And I needed him not to contact Kevin or Sandra or anyone connected to the business until I told him it was time. Ray said he had not spoken to Kevin in 3 weeks, which was itself unusual because Kevin had previously called him every few days with operational updates the way I used to when Ray first went semi-retired. I asked Ray when Kevin had stopped calling. Ray thought about it and said, "About 6 weeks ago, right around the time the amended agreement arrived at my house." I wrote that down on my notepad. 6 weeks ago, Kevin had stopped his regular calls to Ray Doyle. 6 weeks ago, the amended agreement had arrived at Ray's address for a signature Ray had never given. Kevin had been waiting. He had sent the document to Ray expecting a quick signature from a semi-retired old man who trusted his junior partner and had no particular reason to read the fine print. When Ray did not respond, Kevin had not followed up. He had decided to wait and see, which meant he was not certain Ray had read it carefully, and he was gambling that Ray's silence was indifference rather than suspicion. That gamble had now cost Kevin whatever time he thought he had. I thought about the line of credit, 18 months old, drawing against business assets without my authorization. Kevin had needed to remove me from the partnership before the annual business tax filing, which David had explained would require both partners to sign off on the full account structure. If I had still been listed as an equal partner at tax filing time, an accountant preparing the return would have needed my signature on documents that included the unauthorized line of credit. That would have ended the secret immediately. The tax filing deadline was 8 weeks away. Kevin had calculated that 8 weeks was enough time to get the amendment filed, get Ray to sign, present me with a retirement package, and have the whole thing finished before the accountant asked any questions. He had been wrong by 11 days. The 11 days I had spent in the hospital had given him the window he needed to file the amendment. But they had also given me something he had not planned for. They had given me a reason to open Dorothy's lockbox. I made dinner that evening, just soup from a can and bread from the freezer, and I ate at the kitchen table with Dorothy's letter beside my bowl. I did not read it again. I just kept it there, the way you keep something close when you want to remember what you are doing and why you are doing it. After dinner, I washed the bowl and the spoon and dried them and put them away and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the maple tree in the dark. Tyler had a track meet that weekend. Kevin had invited me. I thought about Tyler sitting beside my hospital bed on the second day while I was still groggy, staying for an hour without being asked to stay. 16 years old and 6 feet tall and more interested in cars than schoolwork, and still choosing to sit with his grandfather in a hospital room when he could have been anywhere else. Whatever Kevin and Sandra had done, Tyler had not done it. I decided I would go to the track meet. Not because Kevin had invited me, because Tyler deserved to look up from the track and see his grandfather in the stands, and because I had learned a long time ago that the most important thing a man can do when someone is trying to erase him is simply to keep showing up. I also decided that the following week I would ask David Greer to send Kevin a letter. Not a threatening letter, not a legal ultimatum. Just a letter asking Kevin to meet and discuss the partnership documents at his earliest convenience, copied to the county business filing office, copied to Ray Doyle, and sent to the shop address as well as to Kevin's home. A letter like that does not require a response to do its work. A letter like that tells a man that the person he underestimated has already been to an attorney and already has a copy of what was filed at the county and is no longer alone in knowing what happened. A letter like that changes the shape of a room before anyone walks into it. Dorothy had understood that about paperwork. She had understood it in a way that went beyond legal knowledge into something closer to wisdom, the understanding that a document is not only a record of what was agreed to, it is a record of who was present and who was paying attention. I had been present for 38 years. I had been paying attention my whole life. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and for the first time since coming home from the hospital I slept without waking before dawn. The track meet was on a Saturday morning, and the air was still cold the way Ohio air is cold in late March, a cold that has decided to stay past its welcome and does not particularly care what the calendar says. I wore my good coat and brought a thermos of coffee and found a spot in the middle of the bleachers where I could see the full length of the track. Kevin was already there with Sandra when I arrived. They were sitting near the top of the bleachers, and Kevin waved when he saw me, and Sandra gave me a careful smile. The kind that does not reach the eyes but is constructed well enough that you cannot fault it for trying. I made my way up and sat beside Kevin, and he poured coffee from his own thermos into a paper cup and handed it to me and asked how I was feeling. I said I was feeling better every day. Sandra said I looked well. She said the color was back in my face, which was the kind of observation a woman makes when she has been watching you for signs of decline and has decided to be encouraged by the absence of them. We watched the early field events together. Tyler was running the 400 meters later in the morning, and we had time before his event. Kevin talked about the business, the way he always did when there was space to fill, describing a large commercial contract they had bid on for a new medical building going up outside of town. He said it was the biggest single contract the shop had ever pursued, and that winning it would change the scale of the operation significantly. I asked him who was listed as the primary contractor on the bid. He said Marsh and Doyle. Same as always. I said good. He looked at me for a moment and then looked back at the track. Sandra was watching the field events with the focused attention of a woman who is thinking about something other than what she is looking at. After a while, Kevin said, "Dad, Sandra and I have been talking and we would like to have you over for dinner next week. Just family. We thought it would be a good time to sit down together and go over some things about the future, about the business and about making sure you are taken care of going forward." I said that sounded fine. He said, "We have put together some thoughts about a structure that would let you step back from the day-to-day in a way that is comfortable and financially secure. We want you to know that we have thought carefully about what is fair." I said I appreciated that. Sandra turned from the track and said, "Gerald, we know this past year has been hard. Losing Dorothy and then the health scare. We just want to make sure that you can enjoy this time without the burden of the business weighing on you. Kevin has really grown into the operation. We think there is a way to honor everything you built while also letting Kevin take it where it needs to go." She said it smoothly and with what sounded like genuine warmth, and I thought again about what Dorothy had said, that Sandra knew the difference between what a document says and what a document means. I looked at Sandra and said, "I think that is a conversation worth having." She nodded and turned back to the track. Tyler ran the 400 meters just before 11 in the morning. He came off the final curve in third place and found something in the last 80 meters that moved him to second, his arms driving and his head back and his feet hitting the track with the particular rhythm of a young man who has discovered what his body can do when he stops thinking and just runs. He crossed the line and bent forward with his hands on his knees and then stood up and looked into the stands and found me and raised one hand. I raised mine back. Kevin cheered and Sandra clapped, and for a few minutes we were just a family watching a boy run. On the drive home, I thought about the dinner invitation and what it would look like. Kevin and Sandra at their kitchen table with papers they had prepared, a retirement package with numbers that were meant to seem generous enough that a tired old man would be grateful and sign. The conversation would be careful and kind, and the language would be about honoring what I had built, and about my health and my comfort, and about Kevin taking the business where it needed to go, which was exactly the language Sandra had already tested on the bleachers to see how I responded. They did not know David Greer had already pulled the county filing records. They did not know Ray Doyle had the unsigned amended agreement in a drawer. They did not know Margaret Foss had kept a printed copy of the ledger entry for 18 months, not because she had planned to use it, but because something had felt wrong, and she was a woman who trusted that feeling. They did not know I had Dorothy's letter or the hospital discharge summary or the notepad page with the Tuesday date written on it and underlined twice. They thought they were inviting a grieving old man to a dinner where the paperwork was already prepared and the only thing left to do was get him to sign it. On Wednesday, David Greer called me. He said he had pulled the county business filing records and confirmed the date the amended agreement had been submitted. He said the submission date was the Wednesday of the week. I had been in the hospital, one day after the Tuesday listed as the date of my consent. He said the filing had been made by a Columbus law office that specialized in small business restructuring, and that the attorney of record was not someone he knew personally, but was someone he knew by reputation as a man who asked fewer questions than the Bar Association would prefer. He said he had also spoken with Margaret Foss, and that her account of the line of credit was consistent and detailed, and that her printed ledger copy was clean and legible, and would hold up as documentary evidence. He said he wanted to talk about next steps. I told him about the dinner invitation. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Do you want to go?" I said yes. He said, "All right." He said going was fine as long as I understood clearly that I was not to sign anything at that dinner, regardless of how the papers were presented or how the conversation went. He said if Kevin presented a retirement package, I should tell him I wanted to review it with my attorney before signing. He said that was a reasonable and legally protected position and that no one could fault me for it. I said I understood. He said he wanted to send Kevin a letter before the dinner. Not an aggressive letter, he said, just a formal notice that I was represented by counsel, and that any proposed changes to the Marsh and Doyle partnership structure would need to be reviewed by his office before I could consider them. He said a letter like that would arrive before the dinner and would tell Kevin that the situation had changed without requiring me to say so at the table. I said that was exactly what I wanted. He said he would send it Thursday morning, which would give Kevin Friday and the weekend to think before the dinner on whatever evening Kevin had in mind. I said Kevin had not specified an evening yet. David said, he will specify it the day after the letter arrives. He was right. Kevin called Friday afternoon. The day after the letter would have arrived at the shop address and at his home. His voice was the voice of a man who has been managing something difficult and has decided that the best approach is to sound normal while doing it. He said Sandra was thinking Sunday evening if that worked for me. I said Sunday evening was fine. He said, Dad, I got a letter from an attorney today. From David Greer. He said it as if he was mentioning a piece of mail that had arrived by mistake. I said, yes, David is helping me review some business matters. Kevin said, I did not know you were working with an attorney. I said, I have been working with the Greer family since your grandfather was alive, Kevin. Howard handled the original incorporation. David is Howard's son. Kevin said, right? He paused and then said, I just want to make sure Sunday is still a good conversation. I want us to be able to talk openly. I said I always preferred open conversations. He said, good. He said Sunday at 6. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about what David had said about capable, organized men who make calculated decisions. That when a man like that discovers the calculation is wrong, he usually has enough sense to stop digging. But the woman behind him may think differently. I thought about Sandra preparing for Sunday, adjusting the papers, reconsidering the language, calculating what an attorney reviewing the partnership documents would find, and how quickly he would find it. She was precise and she was smart, and she had about 48 hours to decide whether Sunday was still a dinner worth having or whether a different approach was needed. I thought about that line of credit sitting on the business accounts for 18 months. Kevin had believed it was protected by the amended agreement. Now he knew I had an attorney, and the attorney had been to the county filing office. The line of credit was no longer protected by anything, except the hope that I had not yet connected it to the amendment. I had connected it. Sunday was going to be a different kind of dinner than Kevin and Sandra had planned. I called Ray Doyle that evening and told him to be available Monday morning if needed. I told him David Greer might want to bring us all together in the same room before the end of the following week. Ray said he would clear his calendar. I said, Ray, I need to ask you something. He said, go ahead. I said, when you got that amended agreement in the mail, what was the first thing you thought? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I thought Dorothy would have caught this in the first Sunday review and Gerald is going to need his copy of the original. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, that is exactly right. Ray said, she was the sharpest person in any room she was ever in, Gerald. You know that? I said I knew that. After I hung up, I went to the bedroom closet and looked at the shelf where the lockbox sat. I had put it back after bringing the papers to David, all except Dorothy's letter, which I had kept on the kitchen table under the blue ceramic bowl Dorothy had always used to hold her keys. I lifted the letter out from under the bowl and held it. Sunday was 4 days away. I put the letter back under the bowl and went to bed. Sunday came in gray and cold, the sky the color of old concrete, and I drove to Kevin and Sandra's house through streets that were quiet the way Sunday streets in small Ohio towns are quiet. Empty in a way that feels intentional rather than abandoned. They lived in a subdivision about 3 miles from the shop, a neighborhood of houses that all had the same basic shape but had been personalized over the years with different shutters and different landscaping until they looked like cousins rather than twins. Their house smelled like pot roast and something baking. Sandra had made the kind of dinner that communicates effort without announcing it, the kind of meal that says we care about this evening, without saying why the evening needs to be cared about. Tyler was at a friend's house, which I had expected. This was not a dinner that included Tyler. Kevin poured me a glass of water and asked if I wanted wine. I said water was fine. We sat in the living room for a few minutes before dinner and made the kind of conversation that sits on top of a different conversation. Talking about the track meet and Tyler's times, and the medical building contract and the weather. Sandra had set the dining room table with the good dishes. I noticed that. The everyday dishes were in the cabinet, and the good ones were on the table, which told me she had decided that the occasion deserved a certain formality, which told me she was still planning to present the retirement package at dinner, rather than having changed course after David's letter. We sat down and ate, and the food was good, and for a while the three of us were almost easy together. Kevin talked about his plans for the commercial division of the business, how he wanted to pursue larger contracts, how the medical building bid was only the beginning of a direction he had been thinking about for years. He talked about it with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who had real ideas and the competence to execute them, and I listened and thought about the fact that none of what he was describing required him to remove me from the partnership to accomplish. After dinner, Sandra cleared the plates and brought coffee, and Kevin set a folder on the table between us. He said, "Dad, we put this together because we want to be fair." He opened the folder and slid a set of papers toward me. He said it was a retirement and advisory arrangement that would give me a monthly income from the business for the rest of my life, health supplement coverage, and a named legacy position as co-founder emeritus. He said it honored everything I had built while allowing Kevin to make the operational and financial decisions the business needed going forward. I looked at the papers without picking them up. Sandra said, "We had an attorney review it to make sure it was structured properly." She said it with the calm of a woman who believed that mentioning an attorney made the document sound legitimate rather than raising the question of which attorney and what they had been asked to review. I said, "I appreciate the thought you both put into this." Kevin said, "We just want you to be taken care of." I said, "I know you do." I picked up the papers and looked at the first page. The language was clean, and the numbers were not unreasonable on the surface. A monthly figure that a man who did not know the full value of his stake in the business might consider fair. It was structured to look generous. It was structured so that signing it would have replaced my equal partnership interest with a lifetime income arrangement that Kevin could have reduced or restructured at any point once I was no longer a partner with voting rights. I set the papers back on the table. I said, "I want to review this with David Greer before I sign anything." Kevin said he understood and that there was no rush, but that it would be helpful to have a direction established before the tax filing season. I said, "Speaking of the tax filing, I have a question about the operating accounts." The room changed slightly, not dramatically. Just the way a room changes when the temperature drops a degree or two, enough to notice if you are paying attention. I said, "I came across a line of credit on the business accounts. It was drawn about 18 months ago." I said it calmly, the way you mention a detail you expect to be easily explained. Kevin said, "That was a bridge line the bank offered." He said it without hesitation, which told me he had prepared for this question. He said it was a short-term arrangement to cover equipment costs during a slow quarter, and that it had been mostly paid down. I said, "I would like to see the original approval documentation for that line of credit." Kevin said he could pull that together. I said, "I would also like to understand why the amended partnership agreement submitted to the county lists my consent on a date when I was sedated in the hospital for a cardiac procedure." The room went quiet, not the quiet of surprise, the quiet of a calculation being recalculated in real time. Kevin looked at Sandra, and Sandra looked at the table and then looked up at me with the controlled expression of a woman who has decided that the best response to an unexpected development is to remain composed while she thinks. Kevin said, "Dad, the attorney who handled the amendment said the consent notation was standard language for a partner review, not a formal signature requirement." I said, "David Greer does not agree with that interpretation." I said it quietly. I said, "He also does not agree that a line of credit drawn against a partnership without the signature of an equal partner falls within the operational authority of a single partner, regardless of how the original agreement is read." Sandra said, "Gerald, We were trying to protect the business during a difficult period. She said it with the tone of a woman shifting from one prepared position to another. She said, "You were grieving and then you had the health scare, and we did not want to burden you with decisions that Kevin was capable of handling." I said, "I understand that is one way to describe it." She looked at me and did not say anything else. Kevin said, "Dad, I do not want this to become a legal situation." He said it the way a man says something when he knows it has already become exactly that. I said, "I do not want that either." I said, "What I want is to understand what was filed at the county in my name on a date when I was not capable of authorizing anything. And I want to understand what obligation the business carries on that line of credit that you drew without my knowledge." Kevin put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he said, "The line of credit was larger than I told Margaret it was." He said it quietly. He said the full amount was drawn over 3 separate transactions, and the current balance was not mostly paid down. It was nearly at its full limit. He said he had used a portion of it to cover a personal financial situation that he had been planning to resolve before the annual review. Sandra closed her eyes briefly and then opened them. I looked at my son and thought about the boy who used to ride in the service van with me on Saturday calls, sitting in the passenger seat with his feet not quite reaching the floor mat, asking me questions about pipe sizes and pressure ratings with the earnest seriousness of a child who wanted to understand how things worked. I said, "Kevin, how much?" He told me the number. It was significant. Not ruinous, but significant. Enough to explain why he had needed me removed from the partnership before the tax filing. Enough to explain why Sandra had helped him find a way to make the amendment look procedural. Enough to explain why he had not corrected Carl Bremer in the gravel lot when Carl said, "Good that you are the one in charge now." I said, "All right." I said it the way a man says something when he has heard what he needed to hear and does not need to say anything more about it at this table tonight. I stood up and picked up my coat from the back of the chair. Kevin said, "Dad, I am sorry." I looked at him. I said, "I know you are." I said it and meant it, and also understood that being sorry and having done something were 2 separate facts that would both need to be dealt with separately. I said good night to Sandra. She said good night without looking up from the table. I drove home through the same quiet Sunday streets and went inside and sat at the kitchen table under the kitchen light and called David Greer's answering service and left a message saying I was ready to move forward and asking him to call me first thing Monday morning. Then I sat for a while and looked at Dorothy's letter under the blue ceramic bowl. I thought about the number Kevin had told me. I thought about what David would say about the line of credit and the forged consent notation and what options were available to a man in my position. I thought about Ray Doyle and Margaret Foss and the papers in David's office and the hospital discharge summary with the dates that did not match the consent notation. I thought about Kevin at 16, the age Tyler was now, riding in the service van on Saturday mornings asking about pipe sizes. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the particular tiredness of a man who has confirmed something he had hoped was wrong. But underneath the tiredness there was something else, something steadier. Dorothy's lockbox was still in the bedroom closet. The original 1986 agreement was in David Greer's office. Ray Doyle had the unsigned amended agreement in a drawer and had never once considered signing it. Margaret Foss had kept a printed ledger copy for 18 months because something had felt wrong, and she had trusted that feeling. The business my late wife and Ray Doyle and I had built from nothing on a county road in 1986 was still standing. And I was still a partner in it. Monday morning could not come soon enough. David Greer called at 8:15 Monday morning, which told me he had listened to the answering service message before he got to the office. I told him what Kevin had said at the dinner table about the line of credit, the full amount, the 3 separate transactions, the personal financial situation he had been planning to resolve. David listened without interrupting, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "All right." He said it the way a man says something when the picture he has been assembling has just received its final piece. He said he wanted to arrange a meeting. Not a confrontation, he said, but a formal meeting at his office with all parties present. He said he wanted Kevin there, and he wanted Ray Doyle there, and he wanted Margaret Foss available by phone if needed. He said he was going to send Kevin a second letter that morning, this one more specific than the first, outlining the documentation David had reviewed and requesting Kevin's presence at a meeting on Wednesday at 10 in the morning. I asked if Kevin was required to come. David said no one was required to come to a meeting like this, he said, but a man who does not come to a meeting like this after receiving a letter that specific is a man who has decided to let the legal process answer the questions instead of answering them himself. He said, in his experience, most people preferred to answer the questions themselves. Kevin came. He arrived at David Greer's office on Wednesday at 10 minutes before 10, which told me he had not slept well, and had decided that arriving early was a way of demonstrating something, though I was not certain what. He was wearing a jacket, and he had shaved carefully. He looked like a man who had spent 2 days rehearsing for a conversation he knew he could not rehearse for. Sandra was not with him. I did not ask about that. Ray Doyle arrived at exactly 10, which was Ray, punctual in the way of a man who considers lateness a form of disrespect and earliness a form of anxiety, and has spent 68 years threading the needle between them. He set his copy of the amended agreement on the table in front of him without being asked and folded his hands beside it, and looked at Kevin with the expression of a man who has known someone since they were a child and is deeply disappointed in what that child has become. Kevin looked at Ray's copy of the amended agreement and then looked at the table. David opened the meeting by stating plainly what the documentation showed. He said the original 1986 partnership agreement and the 1998 amendment established Gerald Marsh and Raymond Doyle as co-founders with full partnership rights, and that any subsequent amendment to that structure required the consent of both original partners to be legally valid. He said the amended agreement submitted to the county had been filed with a consent notation listing Gerald Marsh as having reviewed and agreed to the new terms on a specific Tuesday in March. He said the hospital records confirmed that Gerald Marsh had been sedated for a cardiac procedure on that Tuesday and had been admitted to the hospital the preceding Sunday and discharged the following Thursday. He said the consent notation was therefore not a reflection of actual consent. He set the hospital discharge summary on the table beside Ray's copy of the amended agreement. Kevin looked at the discharge summary and did not say anything. David said that in addition to the question of the amended agreement, the business accounts showed a line of credit drawn in 3 separate transactions over a period of 14 months, beginning approximately 4 months after the death of Dorothy Marsh, without the authorization or knowledge of Gerald Marsh as equal partner. He said the current balance of that line of credit represented a material liability against the partnership assets, and that both partners were legally exposed to that liability regardless of who had authorized it. He set Margaret's printed ledger copy on the table. Kevin looked at it and said, "I know." David said, "I want to give you the opportunity to explain, in your own words, how you understood your authority to draw that line of credit without your partner's signature." Kevin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There was a gap in the original agreement, a section about operational financing that did not specify a signature threshold for lines of credit under a certain amount. He said the first draw was under that amount. He said the subsequent draws were not, but by then the line was already established, and he had believed he could resolve the balance before anyone needed to know about it." Ray said, "Kevin, your father and I built that business. We built it together, and we built it honestly, and there was never a day in 38 years when either of us used a gap in a document to take something the other one had not agreed to give." Kevin looked at Ray and did not respond. I said, "Kevin, I need to understand something." I said it quietly. I said, "The personal financial situation you mentioned at dinner Sunday, I need to understand what it was." Kevin looked at the table for a moment. Then he said it had started about 2 years ago. He said he had guaranteed a loan for a business venture a friend of his had been starting, a restaurant in Columbus that had seemed solid and had not been. He said when the restaurant failed, the guarantee came due, and he had not had the personal funds to cover it, and he had been afraid to tell me because I had just lost Dorothy, and he did not want to add to what I was already carrying. He said he had told himself he would fix it quietly and repay the business before anyone noticed. I looked at my son and thought about that. A man in debt and ashamed and afraid to tell his father, and so he had drawn money from the business his father had built, and then had tried to remove the father from the partnership to cover the evidence before the tax filing exposed it. He had not done it because he was cruel. He had done it because he was afraid, and because Sandra had helped him find a way that looked legal from a distance. That did not make it right, but it made it human in a way that pure greed would not have been. I said, "Kevin, why did you not just tell me?" He looked up at me, and for the first time since I had come home from the hospital, he looked like my son, rather than like the man who had been managing me. He said, "Because you had just buried Mom." He said, "Because I had watched you fall apart and put yourself back together every single day for 14 months, and I could not add one more thing to that." The room was quiet. Ray looked at his hands. David made a note on his legal pad and did not look up. I said, "That is the first thing you have said to me in 2 weeks that I believe completely." Kevin put his face in his hands and sat there for a moment. I looked at Ray, and Ray looked at me, and something passed between us that did not need words. The understanding of two men who had built something together for 38 years, and were now sitting in a room with the cost of what happened when you build something worth taking. David said, "I want to outline what happens next, and I want both partners to hear it clearly." He said the amended agreement filed with the county was invalid and would be formally withdrawn, and the county records corrected. He said the line of credit represented a debt against the partnership that both partners would need to address together, which meant a structured repayment plan drawn from business revenues over an agreed period. He said Kevin's personal guarantee liability could be partially absorbed into that structure, but that Kevin would carry a personal repayment obligation to the partnership as well. He said the original 1986 agreement, as amended in 1998, would remain the governing document of Marsh and Doyle Heating and Cooling. He said he would need Kevin to sign a formal acknowledgement of these terms. Kevin looked at the papers David set in front of him. He said, and the other attorney. The one who filed the amendment, David said that was a separate matter that would need to be addressed with the Bar Association and potentially the county. He said that was not Kevin's decision to make and not Gerald's either. He said that the documentation spoke for itself and the appropriate parties would be notified in due course. Kevin nodded. He picked up the pen David offered and signed where David indicated. I watched my son sign his name and thought about Dorothy sitting at the kitchen table every first Sunday of January, reading every page of every document we owned, her reading glasses on the end of her nose, and her coffee going cold because she forgot to drink it when she was concentrating. 34 years of First Sunday reviews. 34 years of knowing exactly what we had signed and exactly what it meant. She had known this was possible. Not this exactly, not Kevin specifically, but something like this. She had known that a business built over a lifetime was the kind of thing that made people do calculations they would not otherwise do, and she had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, quietly and without announcement, with a green metal lockbox and a note written in careful uneven handwriting for a morning she would not be there to see. After Kevin signed, David said there was one more item. He set a single page on the table. He said it was a letter from Dorothy Marsh, written during her final illness and notarized by a Columbus notary in the last month of her life. He said he had found it when Gerald had given him the lockbox documents to review, tucked inside the 1998 amendment in Dorothy's handwriting, separate from the personal note Gerald had already found. I had not known this letter existed. David said Dorothy had written that in the event of any dispute regarding the Marsh and Doyle partnership structure following her death, it was her formal statement as the original witnessing party to the 1986 agreement that the intent of the founding partners had always been equal and perpetual partnership between Gerald Raymond Marsh and Raymond Arthur Doyle, and that any amendment purporting to diminish either partner's standing without the other partner's witnessed and notarized consent was contrary to the founding intent and should be treated accordingly. She had had it notarized. She had tucked it inside the 1998 amendment where it would be found by anyone reviewing the original documents. She had known. Ray made a sound that was not quite a word. I sat at that table and looked at the page with Dorothy's signature on it, and thought about her at the kitchen table in her last months, still sitting up straight, still reading every page, still preparing for mornings she would not be there to see, and I felt the particular grief of loving someone whose care for you outlasted their life. Kevin looked at the letter and then looked at me. He said, "Dad, I am sorry." He said it differently than he had said it Sunday evening. Sunday evening he had been sorry he was caught. This morning he was sorry for something larger than that. I said, "I know you are. I meant it both times, but this time I also believed it would last." The county corrected the business filing records on a Thursday morning in the second week of April, 3 weeks after the meeting at David Greer's office. David called me when it was done and said the amended agreement had been formally withdrawn, and the original partnership structure was restored in the county records as of that morning. He said it in the plain, straightforward way he handled everything, like a man reading a weather report, accurate and without drama. I thanked him and hung up and sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree Dorothy had planted the year Tyler was born had started coming in, the first small leaves opening along the branches the way they do every April in Ohio, tentative at first and then all at once. I had watched that tree for 16 years, and it still surprised me every spring, the way living things have a way of returning that you know is coming and are still somehow not prepared for. The repayment structure David had drawn up required Kevin to make monthly payments to the partnership account over a period of 4 years, drawn from his share of the business distributions. The line of credit itself would be paid down through a portion of the operating revenues which David had negotiated with the business bank once the full picture of the account was presented. The bank had not been pleased, but they had been practical about it, which was what Gerald had expected from a bank that had held the Marsh and Doyle account for 31 years. The attorney in Columbus who had filed the amended agreement had been reported to the Bar Association. David said that process would take time and that the outcome was not Gerald's to control. I said I understood. What I understood was that I had done what I could do, and that some consequences belonged to the people who caused them, and not to the people they were caused against. Kevin came to the shop the Monday after the county correction. I was already there when he arrived, sitting in the front office with Margaret and a cup of coffee, going over the quarterly billing the way I used to before the cardiac procedure had interrupted the rhythm of my days. Margaret had been careful with me since the meeting at David's office, careful in the way of a woman who is relieved that something has been resolved and is not sure whether to mention it directly or simply to proceed as if the world has returned to its proper order. I had told her to proceed as if the world had returned to its proper order. Kevin came through the front door and stopped when he saw me at Margaret's desk. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been afraid to face and has finally decided to face anyway. He said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." Margaret found something to do in the filing cabinet behind her. Kevin poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter and said, "The medical building bid comes back this week." I said I knew. He said, "I think we have a real chance at it." I said, "Tell me about the numbers." He did. He stood at the counter with his coffee and walked me through the bid structure and the material costs and the labor projections and the contingency margins, and I listened and asked questions and he answered them, and for about 20 minutes we were just two men who ran a business together talking about whether the business was going to win a contract. It was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a longer thing and it would come in pieces over time, the way most real things do. But it was a beginning of something, the kind of beginning that does not announce itself but simply starts, the way the maple tree starts every April without asking anyone's permission. I did not give Kevin his old role back unchanged. That would have been wrong for both of us, and David had advised against it in any case until the repayment structure was well established. What we agreed to was a formal partnership review every 6 months, documented and witnessed, in which both partners would review the full account structure together. David would serve as the reviewing attorney. Ray Doyle would receive copies of every quarterly statement going forward. Kevin had agreed to all of it without argument, which told me that the man who had made the calculation about his elderly father, not looking closely at the dates, had spent 3 weeks reconsidering what kind of man he wanted to be. I could not do that work for him, but I could leave him room to do it himself. Sandra was a harder question. She had not been at the meeting at David's office, and she had not called me since the Sunday dinner. Kevin said she was ashamed, which I believed, and that she was also afraid of what I thought of her, which I also believed. I had not yet decided what I thought of her, not fully. What she had done had been deliberate in a way that Kevin's panic had not entirely been, and deliberate cruelty toward an old man who had just buried his wife was not something I could set aside quickly. But Tyler was her son, and Kevin's son, and my grandson, and the boy had sat beside my hospital bed for an hour on the second day when I was still too groggy to know he was there. Whatever came next between me and Sandra would have to be worked out carefully and over time, with Tyler's place in the family as the consideration that mattered most. Tyler came to the shop on a Saturday afternoon in mid-April, the way he used to when he was younger, and Kevin would bring him along on weekend calls. He was too old for that now, and he came on his own, driving Kevin's second car with the particular careful deliberateness of a 16-year-old who is aware that he is being trusted with something valuable. He found me in the back storage area reorganizing the parts inventory, which was a job I did not need to do and was doing because it was satisfying to put things back in their proper places. He stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "Grandpa, can I help?" I said yes and handed him a box of fittings and showed him where they went, and we worked for a while without talking, which was comfortable in the way that only certain kinds of company can be comfortable. After a while he said, "Dad told me some of what happened." He said it quietly, not looking up from the box he was sorting. I said, "I know." He said, "I did not know about any of it while it was happening. I want you to know that." I said, "Tyler, I know that. I never thought you did." He nodded and kept sorting fittings and did not say anything else about it. He did not need to. He was 16 and he was trying to understand something complicated about the people who loved him and had also failed someone he loved, and there was no sentence he could say that would resolve that, and he was wise enough not to try. We finished the inventory, and I locked up the storage area, and we went to the front office, and Margaret made us both coffee, and we sat at the small table by the window, the way I used to sit with Dorothy when she came by the shop on slow Friday afternoons, and Tyler told me about track practice, and a car he had been reading about, and a history class he actually liked, which surprised him as much as it surprised me. Before he left, he stopped at the front door and turned and said, "Grandpa, that sign out front." The green one. Did it used to be on the other side of the lot? I looked at him. He said, "I moved it back last weekend. Dad said it was in the wrong place. He said you would know where it was supposed to go." I looked out the front window at the gravel lot. The sign was back on the left side, exactly where Dorothy had stood, and told the installer to move it 3 inches so it would catch the afternoon light. I looked at Tyler and said, "That is exactly right. That is exactly where it belongs." He said good, and went out to the car, and I watched him drive away with the careful deliberateness of a boy who has been trusted with something valuable and knows it. I turned off the front office light and got my coat, and stood at the door for a moment before locking up. The afternoon light was coming across the gravel lot the way it had always come, finding the raised lettering on the green and white sign the way Dorothy had always said it would, making the name stand out clearly against the late-day sky. Marsh and Doyle Heating and Cooling. Established 1986. I locked the door and drove home and sat at the kitchen table and took Dorothy's letter out from under the blue ceramic bowl and held it without reading it. I had read it enough times now that I knew it by heart, every word in her careful uneven handwriting, every sentence she had written for a morning she would not be there to see. I folded it once along its original crease and put it back in its envelope and set it in the green metal lockbox beside the January review papers going back 34 years, each year clipped together in her handwriting, each year a record of 2 people who had built something together and had trusted each other enough to keep reading every page. I closed the lid of the lockbox and locked it with the small brass key. Then I put the kettle on and waited for the water to heat and looked out the kitchen window at the maple tree coming in full. Now the leaves opened all the way, green and certain in the April light.